always thought time could heal every wound, that if enough time passed and I was far enough away, the old pain would fade like ink smudged in a distant memory. I truly believed that, until that moment. The room was filled with warm golden light. Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed through stories from the past. I sat at the far end of the table, nodding quietly, trying to blend into the joy even though all I felt inside was emptiness. 7 years. This was my first time back in this house after 7 years of cutting off all contact. Not because I had forgotten, but because I wanted to believe that maybe something inside him had changed. Then he stood up, a glass of red wine in his hand, thin like diluted blood. His voice deep and steady, each word hitting my chest like a hammer. I am proud of all my children, except for this failure. In that moment, the entire room fell silent. The wine glass in my hand trembled slightly. And I understood. Not all wounds heal no matter how many years have passed. I do not know why. I remember it all so clearly. Memories I should have forgotten. Those foggy winter mornings when I curled up in a corner of the house, wearing an old sweater that still smelled like cigarettes from the night before. My mother quietly added more water to the thin porridge. And my father, he never looked at anyone. He just flipped through the newspaper, sipped his thick coffee, and said in a cold, judging voice, "That one will turn out to be nothing sooner or later." He said it like I was not even there. Or worse, like I was not worth being seen as a person. I was just a shadow in that house, existing, but never quite right. I was the oldest child. That should have been something to be proud of. But in my father's eyes, it was just the reason to dump all of his expectations on me. Then disappointment. Then contempt. I was not as smart as my younger brother. Not as outgoing as my little sister. I was quiet. I doodled in my notebooks. I stared out the window too long. He hated that. He said I was useless, a dreamer, as weak as a girl. I used to think that if I tried harder, got better grades, spoke more clearly. Maybe just once he would pat me on the shoulder and say, "Good job." But no. I remember once in 9th grade I won 3rd place in a district-level art contest. My mother's eyes lit up when she held the certificate. My father glanced at it, did not congratulate me. He just muttered, "Drawing. What are you planning to do?" Beg on the streets one day, I rolled the certificate up, stuffed it in a desk drawer, and never touched it again. I started learning how to stay silent very early. When you know that anything you say can be twisted, cut off, or make the whole dinner feel heavy with tension, you learn to swallow your words, like a survival reflex. Every meal was a silent performance. My father would ask my brother how many points he got that day. He would nod in approval. He would ask my sister if she was still getting bullied at school. He would smile gently, pat her head. As for me, if I did not get scolded for something, then that was already a rare, peaceful day. I cannot remember the last time he called me by my real name. Most of the time, he called me that one, the useless one, or worst of all, the disappointment. And my mother? She was gentle. So gentle it broke my heart. Every time he yelled, my mother just silently bowed her head and held my hand under the table. Her hands were bony and cold. But I remember there was one time, just once, she stood up in the middle of dinner and said, "Please do not talk to our child like that." I was 10 years old, and the slap he gave her that day kept her silent for years after. I used to think my mother was weak, but now I understand. She was just trying to protect what little was left of a family where everyone had to choose between love and survival. At least, her hand was the only thing that reminded me I still existed. I remember the nights I stayed up drawing with broken bits of pencils on the back of old calendar pages. I drew the world in my imagination, a place with no yelling, no harsh eyes. I drew cartoon characters, talking animals, people with wings. I dreamed of becoming an artist. or at the very least of living in the world I created. But that dream, every time it showed itself, was blown out like a young candle in the wind. I once drew a picture. I was 8 years old. It was a rainy afternoon. My mom had not come back from the market and my dad was napping. I sat alone in a corner of the house, the light from the window falling across the edge of a chipped old table. On the back of an old calendar sheet, I used a tiny worn-down pencil, barely enough to hold between 2 fingers, and started drawing. I drew a bird, not like a real bird. This one was as big as a person with wings so wide they seemed to wrap around the whole sky. On its back was a boy, arms stretched out, smiling, flying through soft white clouds. That boy was me. A version of me I had never gotten to be. I taped the picture to the wall right next to my bed. I knew my father would not like it. But at the time, I just thought if every morning I could wake up and see myself flying, maybe it would not feel so heavy anymore. The picture lasted 2 days. Then one evening, my father walked into my room. His eyes were cold like winter wind. He said nothing, just stepped forward, tore the picture down, ripped it in half, then into quarters, then into eighths. The pieces of paper floated down to the floor. I bent down to pick them up. He just stood there looking at me like I was something that needed to be fixed. A boy drawing, "You want to be a joke for the whole world. Throw that nonsense away." I did not dare say a word, just nodded. But in my mind, something cracked. After that, I put away all my drawing paper. The broken pencil, I kept it. I stuck it in my pencil case like a thorn turned inward to remind myself that dreams can be crushed to pieces when shown to the wrong person. I stopped drawing, stopped hanging things on the wall, stopped telling anyone what I liked. And every time a teacher asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I just said whatever sounded respectable. An engineer, an architect, a doctor. Anything that would make my father frown a little less. But here was the strange part: I stopped drawing, but I never stopped imagining. Inside my head, there were still scenes, characters, movements. They lived within me, even if no one else knew. And not until I left home, not until I touched the world outside, did I dare to gather the broken pieces of that old dream. My hands trembled. My heart was still afraid. But I started drawing again, at first just to breathe. Slowly, I realized that some parts of me were still alive. Very small, but never dead. One day, while cleaning out some old things, I accidentally found that broken pencil from long ago tucked inside an old cloth pouch. It was so small I almost threw it away, but I kept it. Not to use, but as a reminder, if something broken can survive all this time, then maybe so can I. I used to hide a few drawings in my desk drawer. One day I forgot to lock it. My father found them. The paper was torn to shreds, thrown on the floor. He did not yell. He just gave this bitter laugh. I am not feeding some kid who draws cats and dogs for a living. I knelt down and picked up each piece, but I never tried putting them back together again. I do not remember exactly when I stopped waiting for his approval. Maybe it was the day I tried fixing his old radio, and he snapped, "Go study. Do not touch what you do not understand." Or maybe it was the night I spent hours doing my math homework just right, only to hear him say, "If you still get it wrong after all that, then you really are hopeless." I grew up in a house where every wall held the sound of my mom's sighs, the clatter of chopsticks, and the slam of a door that never closed gently. My room was small, cold, and always smelled damp, but it was the only place where I got to be myself, to breathe, to draw, to quietly shrink like a blade of grass growing in the wrong place. High school passed by like a silent movie. I had no close friends. I never hung out. I never rebelled. I just quietly survived, saving every cent from tiny scholarships, working part-time at a print shop, getting my internship paperwork earlier than required, just so I had an excuse to leave that house. I did not hate my father. I just hated the way he turned love into a condition and turned my presence into a burden to tolerate. I used to imagine the day I got accepted into college holding the letter and showing it to him. But I never did. I already knew there would be no hug. No, I'm proud of you. Just another smirk and a cold question. What major will it pay the bills I applied for animation design? Nobody knew. I handled my student loan, rented a room, prepared everything in silence. And then, on a morning in early July, I left. No goodbye. No one saw me off. Only my mom. She stood at the doorway, still holding a kitchen towel in her hand, eyes glistening. She did not say anything. I did not either. The door closed behind me, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe. I used to wonder, if I had been born into a different family, would life have felt lighter? What if one night my father had sat down next to me and asked, "What are you drawing?" What if he had said even once, "I do not understand you, but I will try"? Maybe I would not have needed so many years to learn that I have worth. But those were just empty what-ifs. The truth is, I grew up knowing clearly that I was never enough. I carried that feeling with me like a stain beneath my skin. When you live too long being denied, you start denying yourself. I once tore up a drawing I had just finished, even though it was beautiful. I once turned down a chance to attend a creative summer camp because I thought I did not deserve it. I once forced myself to abandon my dream just to try and earn a nod from a man who never smiled. That was how I lived with a self-worth as fragile as a thread. To the point where, for a while, I thought I had quietly disappeared from the world. No one called my name at dinner. No one asked if I was okay. No one noticed I was in the room unless I had done something wrong. That feeling of being alive but invisible, it makes no sound. But it eats away at your blood, your sleep, and your belief in tomorrow. One night I dreamed I was standing in the middle of the yard. The rain was pouring. I shouted, "Dad!" But no one turned around. I was soaked, freezing, my feet stuck to the ground. In that dream, I screamed, until no sound came out. Then I woke up and realized it was never just a dream. That was how I had felt all through my childhood. That feeling of waving your hand in a house where no one sees you, of being crushed beneath expectations you can never reach. That feeling of hearing your father praise the other kids while you are always just an empty space. I used to be so angry. Angry at him. Angry at my mother for staying silent. Angry at myself for not being the child they wanted. But the older I got, the more I understood. Some people do not know how to love. They only know how to compliment success. They do not know how to hug. They do not know how to say, "I was wrong." And they certainly do not know how to apologize to their son for making him feel like a burden in his own home. When I turned 18 on the night of my birthday, no cake, no wishes. I walked out of that house with a backpack and $300 I had hidden at the bottom of a drawer. No one asked where I was going. No one stopped me. My mom was in the kitchen, her back turned. My dad was on the couch, eyes glued to the sports news. I walked away like I had never belonged there. That night, for the first time, I looked up at the sky and did not feel a weight on my chest. Not because freedom came from outside, but because for the first time, I stood up for myself. Years later, I still remember that image, him not looking up, not saying anything, not trying to stop me. But now grown enough to look back, I ask myself, could it be that he was once a child too, who was never taught how to love? I remember him mentioning briefly that when he was little, he had to memorize multiplication tables before he even knew how to read. Every mistake earned a beating with a bamboo stick. Maybe he grew up believing that love is fear and parenting means making your child afraid. I do not forgive everything he did. But I have started to understand. He too was the product of a twisted kind of love where silence is called strength and control is disguised as fatherly duty. During the day I went to school. Design school was a place for big dreamers with pockets deep enough to support those dreams. I had neither. While my classmates used iPads, digital drawing tablets, or powerful laptops, I used a pencil. I went to the public library early every morning to grab a seat near a power outlet, just to plug in my old laptop that sounded like a blender every time I opened any software. Once we had a group assignment to create a 3D animation. My computer could not handle rendering. I volunteered to write the script instead, but one classmate rejected the idea right away. Let's not risk the group grade. I smiled. I was used to people not believing in me. Every night after work, I walked more than 2 miles, about 3 kilometers back to my rented room. On rainy nights, I was soaked freezing still walking because even a bus ticket was a luxury. On dry nights, my stomach would growl with hunger, my legs unsteady. I once stood in front of a convenience store, staring at a $1 chocolate bar, and after nearly 10 minutes of hesitation, I walked away. Because if I bought it, I would not have enough to eat for the next 2 days. But I never went back home, not even once during that first year. Not because I was angry, but because Sacramento, despite being unfamiliar, was the first place that made me feel like I was no longer labeled the failure. Here I was, a tenant, a dishwasher, a design student, but not his eldest son, and that was enough for me to stay. That first winter in the city was colder than I expected. Not because of the weather, but because of the chill that crept inside when no one asked if you were doing okay at the end of the day. I got used to the sound of my own footsteps on the sidewalk, to eating a plain sandwich next to a utility pole leaning against the wall, watching the car lights pass by. I stopped counting days. I only counted the change left in my pocket and how many times I fell asleep at my desk without realizing my tears had already fallen. But strangely, in those exhausting days, something inside me began to stir. Something small like a faint light at the bottom of a well. One time I turned in a hand-drawn illustration for storyboard class while everyone else used digital tools. The instructor stared at my drawing for a long time, then said only one thing: "You have emotion. This has depth." I did not respond, but I carried those words all day like a warm coat. For the first time in months, I did not feel invisible. I started drawing again, not just to escape, but to tell my own story. The lines became bolder, more minimal, but behind them was the pain I had compressed for so long. I submitted illustrations filled with shades of gray, full of empty space, full of eyes, missing a father, missing a mother, missing a place to call home. Another instructor asked me to stay after class. He placed a hand on my shoulder lightly. "I do not know what you have been through, but your art does not lie." That sentence nearly made me cry, because it had been so long since anyone asked me what I had been through. I started getting invited to small project teams designing characters for an indie game. It was unpaid, but I accepted immediately because it was the first time I was treated as part of something. Not the eldest child, not the failure, just the kid who can draw with feeling. I worked more, learned to match colors, studied software by borrowing computers at the library after class. Some nights I stayed in the corner so long that the security guard had to remind me to leave. And then, I earned my first income from the path I had chosen. A classmate recommended me to design icons for a small fashion brand. They paid me $70, almost a week's pay at the restaurant. My hands shook as I held the bill, not because it was a lot, but because for the first time, something that came from inside me was acknowledged. There was something strange I realized after nearly 2 years away from home. This world is not gentle, but at least it is fairer. Out there, no one pities me. But if I do a good job, I get paid. If I try, I get chances. No one checks my report card to judge me. No one knows I was once the failure in my father's eyes. They just know I meet deadlines and work with care. That alone is enough for me to feel accepted, something I never had in my entire childhood. I started getting small contracts through friends, then online. Designing logos, illustrating books, drawing characters in a Japanese anime style. No one knew I was working on a noisy, outdated laptop that wheezed every time I opened Photoshop. No one knew I lived in a dim room beside a desk fan that sounded like a sewing machine. I did not need them to know. I only needed one thing: to stand on my own. No dependence, no begging, no looking back. I applied for a scholarship for the next semester, attaching all the work I had done in the past 2 years. Once, a professor sat beside me in the hallway and said, "I have never seen anyone so poor, yet so persistent." I did not know whether it was praise or pity, but I smiled because I understood I was on the right path, even if it was a lonely one. I used to think that family, even if broken, was still a place to come home to. But now I am not so sure. I got used to living with no phone calls, no one asking, "Have you eaten?" Every time I opened my phone, my contact list held just a few names of classmates. My mother never texted. Maybe she did not know what to say, and I did not want her to have to choose between me and him. There were nights I sat in front of a screen loading a heavy graphics file, holding a cup of instant noodles, and suddenly felt a weight in my chest. I wished I could show my father that I am not a failure, not to be forgiven, not to be praised, just so he would know I tried even when no one stood by me. I thought about graduation day. I sent out invitations without expectations, without hope. I just wanted to do the right thing. The card was never answered. But at least I had sent it. Then one day I got a message from a cousin. "There's a family gathering. Everyone hopes you'll come." I read that line over and over like it was not meant for me. My heart went still for a few seconds. Then it ached. I do not know why. But after all those years of being pushed aside, just one invitation was enough to shake me. Maybe something had changed, or maybe it was just me naively believing again in something I never had. My brother took a deep breath. Then, more unexpectedly than anything, he stepped up beside me. He stood tall, no avoiding, no fear. "You are not a failure," he said. "It is just no one in this family ever tried to understand you." I looked at him. In that moment, I no longer saw the younger brother who used to hide behind our father, who nodded along at family dinners where I was always left out. I saw a man standing tall, choosing gratitude over silence. But what shook me more was the look in everyone else's eyes. Each gaze slowly shifted from the head of the table to me, no longer avoiding, but something else. Something that felt like they were truly seeing me for the very first time. Before he could say more, another voice spoke up. It was my sister, the quietest among us, who usually just observed, never interfering in family matters. "You paid my hospital fees." When I was too scared to tell Mom and Dad, she said. Her voice was nearly a whisper, but in that breathless room, every word echoed off the walls. I turned to her. Her face was pale, but her eyes stayed steady. "The day I had that small surgery at school, you were the first to call. I never told you this, because I was scared Dad would find out, but you sent money that very night. You never asked why. You never asked for it back." The air in the room wavered. I felt everything slow down, as if time itself was stretching under the weight of truths that had never been spoken. A cousin added, "You helped me revise my college application. I remember you stayed up until 2 in the morning asking me every interview question to help me prepare." An aunt followed. "I once saw him soaking wet in the rain, bringing home a birthday cake for your mother. It was your sister's birthday that year." My mother was still bowing her head, but her hands were clenched tightly. I saw her shoulders tremble slightly. I did not know if it was from emotion or regret. No one said a word, but the room felt suffocatingly still. My father still in the same seat, expressionless. The wine glass had not touched his lips for some time. I swallowed down the lump rising in my throat, not because of the truths being revealed, but because I had never imagined I would be seen, truly seen, by the very people who had stayed silent the longest. It was not me who stood up and shouted, "I deserve this." It was every small thing I had done, every quiet choice, every act of kindness that asked for nothing in return, finally speaking for themselves. For the first time, I did not feel alone in this house. Not because someone apologized, not because my father changed, but because I realized light does not always come from others' approval. Sometimes it comes from living in a way you are not ashamed of. I looked around, a circle of silence, but no longer cold. I saw eyes filled with tears, hands held tightly in laps, and for the first time I saw that not everyone had chosen to side with success. And that was enough. I said nothing. I did not smile. I did not cry. I just nodded like I had just received a gift I had never dared to dream of. I turned back. The door was still open. Outside, night had fully fallen. The wind was still cold. But inside me, something was quietly warming up. It was not joy. It was release. The room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the wall clock, the tiniest sounds, the clink of a spoon against a glass. Someone swallowing suddenly felt loud in an eerie way, as if every sense had been stretched thin by an emotional earthquake that had just gone silent. I looked at my father. He was still sitting there, his back straight, hands on the table, the glass of red wine untouched in his grip. His face showed no emotion, but I could see a subtle furrow forming between his brows, like he had just heard a language he did not understand. We looked at each other, not for long, not in tension, not in challenge, just a look for the first time in years, with no contempt, no defensiveness. I was not waiting for anything anymore, not an apology, not a hug, not a single "I was wrong." I just needed him to know I was still here, still myself, and never once had I fallen. Some battles are not about winning. They are just about not letting yourself lose. I nodded not to him but to myself, then turned to leave. This time, no one called me back, but I knew they were watching, and that for me was enough. I thought that after leaving that room, after hearing those rare moments of defense spoken in my name, that things would settle, that I could just keep going as I had been, that the truths that needed to be said had already been said. But I was wrong. That emotional earthquake turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg. What was left, what no one had dared to face, was still there. And the person to uncover it, surprisingly, was my mother. That night I did not return to my old rented room. I booked a small hotel room on the outskirts of town where no one knew me, where no one would recognize me. I needed space to breathe, to process what had just been torn open and not yet stitched back together. I sat for a long time by the window watching the yellow glow of streetlights on the wet road. What echoed in my mind was not my father's harsh words, but other voices, my younger brother, my sister, my aunt, my cousin. The ones I thought had forgotten, turns out they remembered. The ones I thought had never seen had been silently watching all along. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Mom. Just 7 words. "Tomorrow I want to see you." I read it again and again. Not long, not elaborate, not wrapped in disclaimers like every other message she used to send. And maybe because of that, it scared me. Something about it was different. The next morning, I arrived earlier than planned. She was already there at the same riverside cafe she used to take me to when I was little when Dad was not home. The cafe was the same. Old wooden chairs, rough stone tables, the sound of wind brushing across the water. But my mother was different. She looked older than I remembered, more gray in her hair. Her shoulders slumped a little, her eyes sunken, her cheeks hollow. She wore a gray cardigan. Her frail hands rested on a cup of hot tea, as if she needed something to hold on to. When I approached, she looked up and for the first time in years, met my eyes directly. No avoiding, no dodging. "Are you well?" Her voice was hoarse. I just nodded. She nodded too. Then silence. Long silence. I thought she would talk about last night, about Dad, about the things I had heard, but she did not. She just looked at the river, then sighed. "There is something I have kept from you for a long time." I froze. She had never begun a conversation like that. In my memory, my mother always said safe things, simple things, easy things. But this time it was like she was standing at the edge of a cliff about to leap. She placed her hand on the table. It trembled slightly. "When you were 10, do you remember when your father hit you so hard your nose bled just because you broke his desk lamp?" I nodded. Of course I remembered. It was my birthday. That old lamp, I had wanted to clean it to put it on my desk as a birthday gift to myself, but it slipped. Dad slapped me, not just once. That night, I had planned to leave the house with you. She clenched her hands. I had packed our things. I called for a car. I stood at the doorway. But then, I held my breath. But then your father said, "If you step out of this house, you will never see the youngest child again." I froze. He used all of you to keep me there. She looked up. I did not have the strength. It felt like the world around me collapsed for a second. I thought, if I stayed, at least you would have food, a roof over your heads. I was afraid that if I left, I could not provide for the three of you, and I would ruin your futures. I felt like I could not breathe. I thought I understood my mother. I thought her silence was weakness. I thought the way she turned away every time I was scolded meant she did not care. But I never once imagined she was also a prisoner in that house. I had never seen my mother cry in front of me. Not when my father shouted at her. Not when my youngest sibling got into an accident. Not even during financial crises. She was always the one who stayed silent, burying every emotion behind downcast eyes. But that morning, in that old cafe beside a cup of tea gone cold, she cried. Not with sobs, not with moans, just tears falling quietly. And I realized during all my childhood, I was not the only one who suffered. She told me that when I was born, my father wanted me to become an engineer just like him. From the time I was 3, he sat me next to his drafting table, forced me to hold a ruler and copy technical symbols. When I seemed confused, he got angry and called me stupid. My mother once spoke up, just once, and the slap she received silenced her for good. You do not remember. But when you were 5, your father tore up your sketchbook and threw it into the backyard furnace. Her voice trembled. That day, you had a high fever. I could not figure out why. Now I understand. That was the first time your heart was truly broken. I sat still. What I felt was more than sorrow. It was a nameless sadness for her, and for the child I once was, who believed he was invisible in his own home. But what she said next changed everything. I once found out your father had a hidden bank account, one that none of us were listed on. I frowned. For years he told us we were poor. He scolded you kids for spending money. He forced us all to live frugally. But he had an investment under someone else's name, his cousin's. I could not believe my ears. Your mom only found out because a bank statement got sent to the wrong address. When I asked him, he slammed the table and said it was a safety fund, then banned me from bringing it up again. She looked at me. You once asked why your father never let you study design, why he always yelled, "Where's the money for art school?" Why your younger brother had to hide his college application from him. She clenched her hands. It is because he never cared about your dreams. He only cared about maintaining an image. I could not speak. My childhood had always been haunted by the idea of not enough. Every decision was crushed by one sentence: we cannot afford it. I skipped lunch, walked 2.5 miles, about 4 kilometers to school, sold old notebooks just to pay for photocopies. And now, I realized maybe it was never about money. Maybe my father simply refused to invest in anything he could not understand or control. She looked out at the river. The water was still like it had never known wind. Did you know? Your father secretly removed your name from our health insurance policy. I looked up. When you started college, I went to update the family insurance. Your father's name was still on it, and I found out he had removed you from the list of dependents. In the paperwork, he wrote, "This child has separated from the family and is no longer our financial responsibility." I froze. So when I left home at 18, it was not just emotional estrangement. To him, it was erasure, permanent. My eyes burned, but I could not cry. Some pain goes beyond tears. It spills out instead as a long silence where no words feel big enough to fill it. My mom took an old envelope from her coat. This is a photocopy of the savings book I managed to capture. Back then, she had found it by chance when a bank accidentally sent a statement to our old address. She secretly opened it, snapped a photo, and hid it before he could take it back. She kept it for 10 years, never knowing what to do with it. But last night, after seeing the kids speak up, I thought it was finally time. I held the envelope. Inside were 3 sheets of paper, a savings account under my father's cousin's name, but with our home address listed as the mailing address. The amount was not small. Not a fortune, but enough to send 3 children through college without worry. I folded the papers, placed them back on the table. She said nothing more, just took a sip of her cold tea and placed her hand over mine lightly like a touch from time itself. I am sorry for staying silent so long. After that meeting, I did not go back to my hotel. I wandered through the old streets, past the rows of trees that had witnessed my silent childhood. The late afternoon sun painted the city in gold, but inside me, everything felt buried in fog. I asked myself, what makes a father choose control over protection? What makes a man pick suspicion over trust, even with his own blood? In the days that followed, I started retrieving memories I had buried out of pain. The strange looks from relatives when they talked about Dad. The way Mom would stumble when I asked why we never went on family trips. The tuition bills I had to scrape together myself, even though the family still had money for a new TV, a new motorbike, and new phones for my siblings. I met with my younger brother. He invited me for coffee. This time, unlike before, he spoke first. "Do you know, the day you left, I cried for 3 nights. His voice shook. I did not dare say goodbye. I was scared Dad would get angry, but I was even more scared that you would never come back. I sat in silence. I never understood why Dad hated you so much. But the older I got, the more I realized, it is not because you did anything wrong. It is because you are not like him. You live honestly. You do not pretend. And that scares him because it means he cannot control you." I looked at him, really looked for the first time. He was no longer the youngest child hiding behind Dad. He was growing. Brave. And speaking the truth that had been buried in silence for far too long. My sister called the next day. "Hey, there is something I have always wanted to say, but I was scared Mom would not let me." I reassured her. I once overheard a conversation between Dad and some strange man back when I was in 9th grade. Dad said, "I do not want that kid to ever come back. He was right to leave. A child who does not obey only brings shame to this family. I felt my chest tighten. I did not know what to do. I thought if I said something, I would be kicked out too. I was scared. I stayed quiet. I lived in fear for so long. I started to believe I was the one who was wrong. I did not blame her. I just felt sad. Sad for a family that raised children to always choose between truth and safety. On the third day after the family gathering, I decided to visit the old house for the first time, walking in on my own terms since I left at 18. Not much had changed. The sofa was still worn out, the living room light still dim. Everything looked like it was trying to freeze time, like it could deny any change had ever happened. Dad was sitting at his desk. He looked up when he saw me, but said nothing. His eyes were no longer angry, but not friendly either. Just a glance like he was looking through me, not at me. I walked closer. I did not sit. I placed an envelope on his desk, the one containing the photocopies of the savings account Mom had shown me. He glanced at it, then slowly pushed it back toward me. I do not care about any of that. Do not come here to dig up the past. I stood still. I am not here to dig up the past. I came to let you know that now I know. He stayed silent. I continued. I once wished you would look at me as a person, not to be proud, just not with contempt, but now, that is no longer what I need. I lifted my head and looked him in the eye, not with hatred, not with fear. Now I know who I am. And that no longer depends on you. I used to think if one day my father looked at me and said, "I am proud of you," then every wound inside me would vanish. I lived with that belief for years, quietly, stubbornly, unshakably. I believed that if he nodded once, I would feel worthy, that every scar would be sealed shut by a single acknowledgement. But now, standing before him, not angry, not hopeful, not afraid, I suddenly realized I do not need that anymore. I do not need a hug from someone who never learned how to hug. I do not need an apology from someone who never saw himself as wrong. I do not need praise from someone who only measures worth by grade salaries or reputation. I used to ache every time I watched him praise others, never turning toward me. But now I understand being recognized by someone who never understood me is not the destination. It is just a shadow I chased for too long, until I forgot where the real light was. Because if I only know I have value when someone else says it, then that value never really belonged to me. I have stood in countless rooms, silently waiting for someone to call my name. But today, I no longer need anyone to remember me in order for me to exist. I am still here, living, studying, drawing, loving, failing, getting back up, and all of that is more than enough to prove that I am real. Not because someone confirmed it, but because I dared to be present, dared to breathe, dared to live true to the most honest part of myself, even when no one cheered for it. There are victories that do not need applause. There are journeys that do not need a send-off. And there is a kind of growth that begins the moment you realize other people's opinions no longer define who you are. I stood there looking at him one last time, not sad, not regretful, just light. Like I had finally taken off a backpack of stones I had carried for years, thinking if I tried hard enough, my father would change. Now I know I do not need him to change anymore. I just need myself to move forward unbound by things that never came. He clenched his hand but said nothing. I turned around and walked out of the room, and this time I felt like nothing was left behind. No anger, no longing, just a space being returned to its rightful emptiness. I do not know how long it took me to walk out of that house. I only know that when I stood at the old iron gate watching the last rays of sunlight spill across the tiled yard, I felt empty, not the painful kind, but calm. As if after all those years of trying to understand to be understood, to beg for a kind glance, I had finally touched something deeper than forgiveness, the truth. No one needs to apologize to me anymore. No one needs to say, if only. I do not need any of that. I only need to know that I am not crazy. Not weak, not wrong. I am just different. And different is not failure. My mother called that evening. She said only one sentence. You did what I could not do in decades. I was speechless, not from pride, but because for the first time I felt acknowledged by someone I thought had gone silent forever. On the way home, I saw a child drawing with chalk on the sidewalk, awkward lines, stick figures, crooked suns, grass shaped like wild hair. I stopped, sat down, said nothing. The kid looked at me and grinned. Do you know how to draw? I just smiled. And I understood the things that were forbidden, denied, belittled, can still survive as long as they have a tiny corner to grow in silence. Just like me, the child I once was, who survived even after being rejected, and today, finally, stands tall, needing no one's validation. I had no intention of coming back. After everything I had heard, seen, learned, I thought I should close the book right there at that half-shut door, at that cold final glance at the wall where my name had long been erased. But then, on a completely ordinary afternoon, while I was standing in front of a half-finished sketch, the last sunlight slanting across the page, something strange stirred in me, unfinished. Something was still incomplete, not out there, but in my heart. So I went. No warning, no plan. I just put on my jacket, slipped into my shoes, and walked out the door as if my feet already knew the way home before my mind did. The road back to the old house was so familiar, I did not need to look at street signs. Still, the same row of trees, shedding leaves, the same moss-covered walls, the same rusty gate that once opened to a place I called home, then a prison, and eventually stopped calling anything at all. I stepped in. No knocking. No need to be invited. My father was sitting at his desk as always. The yellowish desk lamp cast light over his face, which now had more wrinkles than I remembered. His hand held a notebook, but his eyes were not reading. I was not sure he had heard my footsteps until he looked up. There was nothing in his eyes that made me stop, nothing that made me turn away. We just looked at each other, two people who once shared a roof now, so distant they did not even know where to begin. I did not sit, did not speak, did not ask. How have you been? I just stood there as if that silent presence was the clearest sentence I had ever managed to speak in my life. I looked at him, not waiting for a nod or a compliment or an apology. In truth, I realized I had never really needed those things. Everything I once grieved for, bled for, broke down for, came from the belief that love had to come from him in order to matter. But now I know love does not have to be proven by someone who never learned how to give it. He took a deep breath like he was about to say something, but he did not, and I did not wait. Because this time I was not here to listen. I was here to look closely, to look at the man who had followed me like a shadow, not to blame him, but to finally understand. Maybe he too had been a victim of a cold kind of upbringing of a time when gentleness was seen as weakness and control was mistaken for fatherhood. I do not know if he understood why I came back. Maybe not. But that no longer mattered. I just wanted to do this for myself, not for a blessing, not for approval, not for some hollow sense of filial duty. I nodded. A small nod. Nothing grand, nothing dramatic. But to me, it was the gentlest way to say I forgive not him, but myself. Then I turned and walked away. No one called me back. No one reached out. But this time, when the door closed behind me, I did not feel abandoned. I left quietly, like someone returning a memory to where it belongs, not erasing it, but no longer carrying it. On the way back, I passed the same old intersection, the place where I stood for a long time, the night I left home at 18. Back then, I carried anger, but now I carry peace. Peace not because everything has been resolved, but because I no longer let those things imprison me. And that is enough. I left that house when the sky had already darkened. No moonlight, no stars. Just a thin mist settling over the trees, the old tiled roofs, and each footprint I left on the damp road. Every step felt like a silent line being written, not with words, but with soft, steady breaths. I did not play music in the car. I did not check my phone. I was not thinking about work or tomorrow. My mind felt empty but not hollow. More like I had just set down something heavy I had carried on my back for so long that now, having let it go, there was nothing left to feel. I had imagined that confrontation 100 times. In my head, it might have been a shouting match, or an emotional explosion, or at the very least, an apology. But no, none of it happened the way I imagined, and it did not need to. I thought of my father, of the way he sat so still, the light in his eyes long faded, his hands trembling just slightly as he set the teacup down. For the first time in my life, I did not feel angry. I did not feel sorry for him either. I just saw someone tired, worn out, like a man who had walked too far down a road he never meant to take, but kept going because turning back felt impossible. Not for lack of direction, but for lack of strength, and maybe even the belief that change was still an option. Some people, I have come to realize, cannot give you what you need, not because they do not care, but because no one ever taught them how to give. They are not heartless, they are just unequipped. Raised in environments where silence was survival, where gentleness was mistaken for weakness, and where control was called love. They inherit a language that never had room for softness, and so they never learn how to speak it. I grew up in a house like that. A house with no hugs. No, I'm proud of you. No hands brushing your hair back just because. No lingering moments of warmth. It was a place where silence was considered peace, where emotions had to be swallowed, not shared. Where love was never freely given, only earned through achievement, through obedience, through becoming the version of yourself that someone else wanted to see. And I accepted it for a long time. I thought that was normal. I thought I had to try harder, be better, quieter, tougher. I thought that if I wasn't accepted, it must have been my fault. That maybe if I could just fix myself a little more, shrink a little smaller, please a little better, I would finally be enough, finally be seen. But now, standing on my own 2 feet that have walked through years of quiet pain, I finally understand something fundamental. I survived, not because I was deeply loved, but because I never stopped believing that love is real. And more importantly, I stopped waiting for it to come from the places that had none to give. I found it in other places. Not in the old house that raised me, but in the people who chose to see me as I am. In the simple, sincere words of friends who said, "Thank you," without expecting anything in return. In the quiet glance of my youngest sibling, the only one who once spoke up for me when no one else did. I found it in a message from my mother, sent late at night with no punctuation, no flourish, just 7 shaky words that told me she still wanted to meet, and that was enough. I found it in the way someone once looked at one of my drawings, one that I made during a long gray night when I felt more invisible than ever, and whispered, not to me, but maybe to themselves, "This is heartbreakingly beautiful." That was love too. It came in small, quiet moments. It came in pauses, in second glances, in people who listened without interrupting, in friends who stayed even when they did not fully understand, in teachers who said, "Your work has depth," in strangers who messaged me just to say, You made me feel less alone. Love did not come loud or grand or perfect, but it came, and maybe that is the point. Maybe love, when it is real, does not need to arrive with fireworks. Maybe it does not always come from the people we hoped for in the ways we imagined. Maybe it simply finds us when we are honest enough to stop pretending we do not need it, when we stop proving and start allowing, when we stop running and start resting. I used to think love had to look like acceptance from my father, that it had to be the kind of love I never got but always craved. But now I know love that hurts to earn is not love worth keeping. And sometimes it is not the world that needs to change, it is where we choose to look. Because once I stopped staring at the door that never opened, I started noticing the windows cracked open quietly, kindly, waiting for me to breathe. I am not a failure. I am someone who dared to stand up and walk away even when everything inside me was trembling. Someone who chose to live truthfully, even when it cost me loneliness, misunderstanding, and exhaustion. And now I do not return to win. I do not need to prove who was right or wrong. I only need to know. I walked away and I did not lose myself. I pulled over, rolled down the window, and let the night breeze rush in. The scent of damp grass, the smell of wood smoke from somewhere nearby, the scent of a city I used to resent because it held too many memories, now suddenly felt familiar again. I closed my eyes. I did not think. I just listened and breathed. Far off in the sky, a faint glow began to rise. A sliver of light, small, thin, but enough to see that what lies ahead is no longer darkness. I do not know where I will go next, but I do know there is nothing I need to go back for. No more running, no more clinging. I just keep walking, and this time, it is for me. There are wounds that never fully heal, but somehow we learn to live with them. We do not forget them. We do not pretend they never happened. Instead, we carry them like quiet echoes of what we have endured. They stay with us not to weigh us down, but to remind us of how far we have come. Sometimes they show up in the quiet moments, in a song that brings back an old memory, in the way your body tenses at a familiar tone of voice, in a certain date on the calendar. They do not scream anymore, but they still whisper, and over time you stop hating the hurt. You stop resenting the pain. Because without it, you would not have learned how to get up on scraped knees, how to wipe your own tears, how to whisper, "I'm okay," even when you are still breaking inside. I used to think strength meant forgetting, that in order to move on, I had to leave it all behind, the memories, the disappointments, the years of being unseen and unheard. I thought I had to erase the past to create a better future. But I was wrong. Real strength is looking your past in the eye and saying, "You do not get to define me anymore." It is standing tall in front of everything that once tried to break you and no longer shaking. It is knowing there are wounds you cannot heal, relationships you cannot fix, words you will never hear, and still choosing to live, and to live truthfully. I was once a child who just wanted his father to look at him with gentleness. Just once. I was the young man standing at his graduation alone in the crowd, scanning every face and realizing no one came. I was the adult who worked until he had nothing left to give, just hoping someone would say, "I'm proud of you." But that praise never came, and eventually, I stopped waiting for it. Because I learned something: we do not need anyone's approval to live our truth. We do not need to be validated to have value. And we especially do not need to chase after the acceptance of people who never had the courage to truly see us. You might be the child labeled as a failure. You might be the one who was left out at every dinner table, the one no one defended, the one everyone misunderstood. You might carry a cold, silent kind of pain, one that has no name but follows you everywhere. But hear me clearly, you still deserve freedom. You deserve a life that is not built on shame, not weighed down by the silence of others. You deserve to breathe without guilt, to speak without fear, to exist without needing permission. Forgiveness sometimes is not something we give to others. It is a gift we give ourselves. It is what we do when we decide, I will no longer carry this bitterness in my chest like a rock. Because if you carry it for too long, you forget what breathing feels like. You forget what softness feels like. You forget that life can be more than just enduring. You might still have scars. And that is okay, because scars mean you survived. So if you are carrying pain, if you have memories that still make your chest tighten, if you have wounds that no one else sees, I hope you know this: you are not weak. You are not broken. You are not a failure. You are human, and you deserve to be here. Believe me, you do not need to be recognized to have value. I do not know what you carry in your heart. Maybe it is a memory you have tried to forget, a sentence that cracked something inside you, a time you sat at a family dinner feeling completely invisible. Or maybe it is a quieter kind of pain, one without a name, one no one sees, but that quietly eats away at you each day. I used to believe that only those who had been properly loved could heal, that people who were hugged, told, "I'm proud of you" by their parents, only they had the strength to rise, and that people like me, like you, might always walk through life carrying that silent weight inside. But I was wrong, because I learned something. Healing does not begin with forgiving the one who hurt you. Forgiveness may come or it may never come, but it is not the first step. The first step sometimes is simply to stop. And dare to ask yourself one question: where does it hurt? When you ask that, the first thing is not the answer. It is the acknowledgement. It is stopping yourself from hiding behind "I'm fine," which you have said too many times. It is looking in the mirror into your own eyes and saying, for the first time, "I am tired, but I am still here." If you can write it down. It does not have to be beautiful. It does not have to be poetic. Just be honest. Write to the child inside you, the one who was scolded for no reason, called useless, ignored in his own home. Write to them like a long-lost friend. And just write. Or maybe allow yourself to rest, not quitting, not giving up on school or work, but resting from the burden of pretending to be okay every day. Resting from the need to be strong all the time. Resting from roles you no longer want to play. Just sit down, take a deep breath, and do not feel guilty about it. Those things, though they may seem small, are how you begin to stop the bleeding inside. No one can live forever with an unstitched wound. And you do not need to be strong to heal. You just need to be honest. Honest with yourself. We cannot change the past. We cannot reclaim the hugs that never came, the words never spoken, the moments of hope we swallowed down. But we can soothe the present. And from there, we can begin to create a future that no longer repeats old patterns of pain. A future where you do not have to please anyone except yourself. I do not have wise advice to give. Just one thing I know for sure: you do not need to be perfect to begin healing. You do not need recognition to live your truth. You just need to take a step, even if it is small, even if it is uncertain, even if you are still in the dark. Because you are worth it. If you are still here, quietly listening to the very last second. Thank you. Not just for watching a long video, but for giving yourself your own time. For facing memories not everyone has the courage to revisit. For walking a path that may seem like someone else's, but might also be yours. If you saw yourself in this story, if you were once the one who had to walk away in silence, the one no one listened to, the one who survived days of being misunderstood, then you are not alone. We make videos like this not to tell sad stories, but to remind you you have the right to live your truth. And real light begins from within. Hit subscribe if you want to keep walking with us, so that each week there is a moment when you are heard, understood, and touched by something no school ever teaches, but that defines your life. And if you believe this video might reach someone who needs it, do not hesitate to share it. Who knows? Maybe your one click will be the beginning of someone else's healing. We are here to help you write the next chapters of your life, quietly, but never without meaning. See you in the next video.